Good afternoon. Hope you all enjoyed lunch. I certainly did. The desserts were too tempting for words. This afternoon I want to talk about the issues around agile operations and business agility, and an idea around zero friction, of which zero-touch automation is a part of achieving zero friction. And I want to say a little bit about our TM Forum Open Digital Architecture, which is a regrouping of some of our prior assets, and I'll cover that. Some of the points I covered on the workshop yesterday, but it's not a complete copy of everything. There's more detail in certain areas, and I've skipped over some other aspects which we covered yesterday. Okay, so I'd like to sort of talk about the subjects. I want to talk about the business drivers for zero friction and agility, and then talk about open digital architecture, and then go through a few exemplars of where we're doing specific concrete work to try and address some of the issues that are arising around creating zero friction or zero-touch automation. I want to look at some of the operational processes, things we've done there, and something we're doing in something called open digital architecture production. Talk about onboarding and lifecycle automation and lifecycle processes. Talk about our APIs, and a little bit about model-driven approaches, and some of the thinking around 5G monetization, and I'll provide a summary at the end. Okay. So one of the challenges we have in the telecoms industry is there's an awful lot of competitors, and it's getting more and more competitive as we speak. So there are the traditional competitors that large service providers are encountering, which are generally drawn from what I describe as the traditional service provider community. But what we're starting to see is new companies starting to emerge that are coming from a cloud-native point of view. And I think the most recent one that we've seen was at Mobile World Congress, which is Rakuten, which is putting up a completely virtualized mobile network, or at least that's what they claim they're going to do. But you're seeing activities from companies like Microsoft and Amazon hosting services which have been traditionally telecom services. You can buy VPNs, you can buy firewalls, you can buy routers, all sorts of things, and run them up from their marketplaces. Increasingly, you're starting to see the end customers expressing a little bit of frustration with what they're getting from service providers, and they're starting to do it themselves. And you'll see lots of companies, John Deere, VW, I happen to know quite well, are starting to run up internet-based services, so they're building a deep relationship with their customers, providing internet-based services and value-added services in that area. And you're starting to see some maverick new entrants, which are now starting to look a little bit like the incumbents. So Jio, I think, grew from nowhere to owning a very large part of the Indian mobile marketplace by some very aggressive tactics, and now I think are something like number 2 or something like that in the mobile space in India. So, lots of competition, and that when you get into a competitive environment, you've got to figure out how you lower your costs and whether you need to be thinking about moving into adjacent markets. So these figures taken, I think, from Ericsson and Arthur D. Little shows on the left-hand side how the growth is occurring in current operator services, and where the industry potential is to grow, particularly for 5G enabled ecosystems. So a lot of 5G is about creating services that are differentiated in terms of their non-functional characteristics like performance, latency, things like that, but delivering them into specific industry verticals such as smart cities, Internet of Everything, energy, and other types of industry verticals, health, that sort of thing. Now, the assessment is that in this growth area, there's around about 582 billion worth of addressable market. And the growth rate in this market appears to be much higher than the traditional connectivity services. So the takeout from this is, what is it you have to invest in order to address both the lowering of costs in your own current marketplace, and how will that help you address the new marketplaces which have got very high available, quite high available revenues, and are also growing quite rapidly. And that's kind of the synthesis of where we're going to with zero friction. And it turns out the ability to put together services rapidly and friction, without friction, and deliver them into these industry verticals is really part of the heart of what service providers need to do to address these new businesses. And as an incidental byproduct, that requires automation internally, which itself lowers the costs of existing services. So this is a little bit difficult to read, but there were some quite interesting figures in light reading about investment levels by various actors or stakeholders in the telecoms industry. And what's interesting is that it shows at the bottom Telefonica, but it's not just Telefonica, has got an investment level of around about 1.7% of sales into what would be broadly called innovation. But when you start to look up the tree and you start to look at like the network equipment providers, and I've circled Nokia as an example, they're around about 5.78% of sales is going into innovation. But unfortunately, some of the new entrants like Google are investing at levels like 15%. So what that means is that part of the message is that service providers in moving forward need to be working with partners that are able to create higher investment levels in innovation than they themselves are able to do. Now, one thing to note here, of course, is there's a large number of service providers, and collectively, this 1% or a fraction of this 1% could equal some of these other suppliers. But that's not the way the service providers are behaving at the moment. So generally these investments are largely on their own internal view of what they want to invest in, rather than sharing those investments with other service providers to work, to compete in the marketplace. Now, earlier on today you heard some presentations from, I think it was PCW and from Telstra, about the industry needs to share more, do more collectively, and you're starting to see evidence of that in the open source community. But these are some really important numerical indicators that set out the facts of what it is that service providers can do with their available resources. And the message is you need to be working together more closely, and you need to be thinking about investments that are addressing these new addressable markets in these industry verticals, rather than just purely looking at investments that are focused purely on internal operations. There's another piece of information that shows for the service providers, and you'll see here that the investment levels by service providers range from very low numbers around about 0.5% of sales up to around about 2%. But in general, the trend with service providers is not only is the actual expenditure on innovation low, but the expenditure is going down. So in order to have effect, you need to be more efficient in the way in which you're doing investments, and there are opportunities in that area, but also you need to be thinking about collaborating more. So one of the things that we've noticed is that 5G is the great investment opportunity that's being talked about. And a lot of the discussion at the moment is around the radio technologies, the networking technologies, which essentially just deliver more connectivity. But really what we're seeing in 5G is the more interesting bit is the growing markets at the top, where we're starting to see service providers thinking about how they enter these industry verticals, what the common business capabilities are that can be shared across multiple industry verticals, where the differences lie between the industry verticals. And we've coined this as being a digital partner rather than just being a connectivity partner. What our studies show, and the contributions we get from service providers supports this, is that, and we have a research activity where we've done some surveys and some studies in this area, shows that we need a different way of thinking about delivering services in the future, and we've termed this like a 5G operating model. And basically, these kind of new operating models, which affect the way you work internally, are needed in order to compete in these growing markets. Okay. So we've identified within the TMF and the studies we've done 5 key challenges in this area. One is about business and IT agility, which we've talked about yesterday, and several speakers have talked about the importance of being able to put together services quite quickly. Our numbers I put up on Monday, we're trying to get the concept to cash cycle time down from typically 18 months to around about 18 days. And that's consistent with the numbers that Joanne was talking about prior to lunch with Telstra's experiences. Cost optimization is still necessary, so you need to be handling both sides of the equation, the revenue side and the cost side. And one of the things that is clear from 5G is there are opportunities to optimize CapEx and OpEx costs. CapEx by shared use of assets for both fixed and mobile, supporting multiple types of services, and also OpEx if you can automate those operations. All of this is needed to deliver customer experience, and I think if you were pitching this to a customer base, you'd probably put this at the top, but all of this is about being a more effective partner, being seen to do what you say you do, and doing it quickly and efficiently. The other point we raised was about B2B growth and also B2C growth. We're starting to see much more interest in automating the relationships between service providers, largely because there's a need to partner for these new services in industry verticals. But the same thing is happening with the customer base, much of a growth in sort of 360-degree customer experience portals and those sorts of things. So all of these are kind of drivers that we see are important about characterising the digital transformation for service providers and, if you like, the operations centre of the future. I want to say a little bit about our open digital architecture. Now, although this is a new name, it's actually a refactoring of some of our existing assets. Typically what we've been doing is developing assets under individual projects, and they've often inherited names that are a bit different. So what we're doing at the moment is bringing together a lot of our existing assets and refactoring them. In some cases that does require some changes. And the general banner for the technical parts of this is open digital architecture. And it's open because a lot of it is based on APIs, and a lot of our material is now available publicly after it's been member approved. Okay. So the thesis here is that the digital capability that we need to generate needs to transition from a mindset of a cost-centric, cost-reduction, internal mindset towards investing in transforming the 95% to support these new growth markets. Now, fortunately, zero-touch automation is required for both. So you're in a rather fortuitous serendipity situation that investing in automation delivers in both dimensions. It delivers against both your existing services and also against your future services, provided you think about automation in terms of dealing with the evolution of your existing legacy capabilities. So typically, the past has been about internal supplier focus, about operations, setting out what they want operations systems to do. This has led to monolithic systems architecture, projects that have been based on waterfall, very deep technical integration and technical expertise, and often rather spectacular big bang transformations, some of which work and some of which don't work. What we're seeing is that the models we need to move towards are more of a business innovation support in these new growth areas, about modular API-enabled architectures, agile front ends, super stable back ends. So there's a bit of a difference between like the web front end and the analytic processing in the back end. Something about business and technology expertise, which comes around from things like DevOps, where you've got both business owners and the technical owners working together, and also the concept of continuous innovation and development. So all of these are characterising effectively what the future looks like. We have activities in our open digital framework that covers all of this that I've described on the right-hand side. The open digital architecture is really about the technical artifacts that underpin that. So things like, for example, transformation metrics, maturity models, things like that, business models, those sorts of things, business model analysis would fall under the ODA open digital framework, whereas something like, say, for example, concrete business capabilities implemented behind APIs would fall under open digital architecture. So this slide I think I used yesterday is really about the idea of going from concept to cash, and it's about going through a process of conceiving, designing, realising, and then getting into service. Now, the traditional approach has been rather monolithic around OSS, BSS, and networks and operations being kind of vertically integrated. What we're moving towards is something which is a much more platform, API, services-based approach based on an assumption that you're supporting virtualized infrastructure, cloud-native operations, particularly around things like AI, and enabling real-time operations. Now, this diagram shows a couple of zero-touch aspects. One is the traditional automating the operational processes. This is the arrow in the center. But there's also a requirement to automate the partnering processes. And the third aspect of this is the automation of the life cycle of the entities that are used in the operational processes as well. So there's actually 3 automation activities that are required to achieve zero friction. Okay. So just as a little a map of the things that we do, this shows all things we do. The open digital architecture, is the part in the center, and that's what I'm going to focus on at the moment. Okay, so this particular architecture is based on an adaptation of TOGAF, enterprise architecture models. This shows a kind of a life cycle view going from a business architecture view through an information systems architecture view through to a technical architecture view, which is about how you implement things, things like service buses, things like software components, things like Kafka buses, and then there are issues around deployment, which might be around the use of API gateways, load balancers, for some of the things we heard about around A/B testing and things like that. But all of this is underpinned at the bottom by an agile and model-driven approach. So what we're trying to do is get to the point where the concepts, which are on the left-hand side, can be expressed in business terms, and we can go through in a model-driven, systematic way, completely from the left, which is the business vision of what you're trying to do, right the way through to the implementation. Now, most of the focus to date has been in the information systems architecture, and I'll focus on that today, but we have got activities in the area of APIs, componentization, and our Catalyst projects are particularly focused on the items on the implementation side, on the right-hand side. So we've developed a functional architecture, which I discussed briefly yesterday, but I just want to bring out a few additional points about this. So this is this is the way we describe, from information systems point of view, the information systems capabilities that we need. And we're divided into a number of functional groups. And the intention is that each of these functional groups will have functions, IT functions within them. This will replace what we call the telecoms application map by more of an IT function map. And those functions will be supported by our open APIs, so that the way you access them is through a service-orientated approach. So we divided this into a number of areas. One is about engagement, which is a 360-degree of the customer and a single customer experience. In some cases, in the future, that will be leveraging the AI management, which is on the other side, which I'll come to in a moment. We're trying to bring all the party management related stuff together so that we can manage parties, be they partners or retail customers, in a systematic way. And there are some specific security and privacy issues around the information in this area that require specific consideration. We're building a core commerce open source implementation, which I'll briefly talk about later, which is called Business Operating System. That's going to be demonstrated at Nice. The key principle of it is to build a system which is based about delivering products made up of other products, and that it sells what is available, not how it is implemented. What we're trying to do is to make certain that the production area, which I'll come on to in a moment, actually translates from the what is the product to how it's delivered completely within the production area. One of the observations from many service providers has been, and I think we heard this from Joanne a bit earlier, is typical integrations are vertically integrated, so that the product part of the company is very tightly integrated with the specific technologies. And this is a specific objective in the TM Forum, to separate these two, the what and the how. That's a very clear objective. So a lot of the things you'll see around APIs that have been developed in technology groups, for example, would sit within the production area. And we're looking at what the APIs are and the services that we need to expose from production into the core commerce area. We're using, for the Catalyst projects, a couple of ONAP implementations, but if we could get an OSM implementation, that would be fine too. They're coming from Vodafone and Orange. And on the right-hand side, but not least, is the use of AI. Now, AI is a little bit more pervasive than just a functional block. When you deploy it, it's often integrated into components of production, core commerce, and also the engagement management areas. So this is a functional view of the functions that are required. When you build components and deploy them, some of the functions from one area may be combined with others. So don't get this to as kind of, we're going to build components exactly in alignment with these boundaries. Okay. So just an example of some of the things that we're doing from a kind of a conceived point of view. We're doing research activities, we run catalysts in this area, we run development and education activities. In the area of design, we've got a business process framework, we have an information and data modelling activity, and I can't stress how important information models are in this area. Anything that's automated needs to be underpinned by models. And all of the automation that we've been talking about, whether it's the traditional end-to-end operational process, the life cycle processes, or the partnering, needs to be thought through in terms of what are the models that we're building so that we can automate them. And I think this is something that most service providers haven't thought through adequately. The industry at large doesn't think about models enough, and they are complicated, or they can be complicated. We've got a open digital architecture, and particularly our API program. We have about, I'll talk about that later. We've got about 54 APIs, I think, at the moment, and we're building an open digital lab, which we'll be showcasing at our event in Nice, which is a cloud-based solution. It happens to be based on IBM Bluemix, and we'll be running our BOSS open source implementation on that. We also, in the Realise area, we look at procurement best practices, we've got industry standards and APIs, we've got transformation guides, and we've done quite a lot of work on the how do you get, what's the vision of where you're trying to get to, and how do you operationally do that? Because this Realise area isn't just about the technology, it's about transformation to the way the organisations think about themselves, about the way they operate, and about the kinds of technologies that they need to do that. We also are starting to look at governance best practices, rapid onboarding, which I'll talk about, and AI-driven customer service experience and operations. Some of these are more being explored in Catalyst projects at the moment. Okay, so I'll move on. I just want to go through some examples of the sort of things that we're doing. So in the business operating system, this is a core commerce piece. This has to link through to ODA production. And what we've determined is, so that if you look at this, the bottom half of this, which is our models around something we call customer-facing services, resource-facing services, VNFs, resources, those kinds of parts of our information model, which is called, I think, informally SID, or Shared Information and Data Model. These sit largely within the ODA production and the OSS catalogue. Above it sits this core commerce, which is largely looking at products and simply wants to map products onto the specific CFSs or customer-facing services from the production area that enable that particular product. So notice that what we're doing is we're trying to simplify the BSS concerns, and we're trying to move the complexity of how this is all done into a specific area. The complexity doesn't go away. It's about separation of concerns. This particular diagram happens to come from Orange, and it's based on their inputs into business operating system. Interesting to note here is none of this would work without the models that we've got in the TM Forum in our shared information and data model. Okay. The other thing we started to look at is based on about 2 network as a service catalysts and 5 5G catalysts, we started to put together a kind of a view of what would the internals of ODA production look like. And the things we've concluded are that we need to expose APIs, which you heard about before lunch, called Network as a Service APIs. And we have a definition of those, which is about to be published. Okay? And it covers quite a wide range of things. It's about fulfillment, pre-ordering, problem management, performance reporting, billing. It covers quite the whole range of things that's required. Now, within a service provider, you have to deliver this from some kind of operational domain. So at the top end, it's about deciding in a service provider how to use those networks as a service, what services you're exposing, and which operational domain is going to be responsible for that. Behind that, you may have other customer-facing services that are actually only used internally, but some of them will be end-to-end. Below that, we see examples in the industry, and particularly we've seen some examples in the 5G models about combining transport networks with mobile components in order to do end-to-end management. These are highly technical and really are best modelled as resource services in the bottom area. And at the bottom, at the very bottom, what we see from most standards groups that are focused on technology is they define some kind of technical domain. That's what you can go and buy. So the challenge is, how do you integrate these together from top to bottom using models and a modern approach? How do you manage the life cycle of all these entities, which are on different life cycles? And you'll see behind this, to do that, you need a life cycle management and an integration fabric which is somewhat consistent across all of these functional entities. And on the right-hand side, we have something on intelligence management. Now, we have a very detailed document about how to use intelligence management. It happens to be called IG 1177. It's based on some Etsy Ganna work adapted to our particular environment. Okay, I have to move on a bit. So on the onboarding. So that's about the operational processes, about automating zero-touch process. This is about onboarding. So we did quite a bit of work with AT&T, Orange, and people from DT, I think it was, on the whole life cycle of how do I go out and buy something? How do I decide I've bought it? How do I understand what the licensing conditions are with that? How do I understand operationally the configuration I need to deploy it? And then how do I deploy and operate it, be it either a physical device or appliance or a virtualized device? And there's several things going on here from a service provider. On the front end, you're acquiring individual software and physical assets from suppliers. And then in the middle, what you're doing is you're collecting those together in a particular configuration to deploy them as a service on the right-hand side. Now, the work we've just been doing is to put together a Tosca-based template, that's a version 1.2 template, for how you add the metadata into Tosca to manage the whole of this commercial, operational, and technical onboarding process. Now, most of the onboarding processes that you see today only deal with the technical piece of taking software images and placing them into an operational environment. This is dealing with the stuff upstream from that, which is the commercial licensing operational metrics, some of which are used to drive the licenses, by the way. So that's another area we've done some quite significant work on. The other area is around marketplaces. We put together a zero-touch partnering marketplace, which was showed at our Kuala Lumpur event. This shows a complete life cycle for bringing on partners and products from partners and how they can be put up into a marketplace, can be bought and sold between suppliers and consumers. And this is all based on TM Forum APIs. And I think this is probably going to be repeated probably next year in a sort of a more elaborate version. But you'll notice this covers both design time and run time. And this brings out another important point, which is it isn't just about the operational processes. It's about automating the design processes, which is the equivalent in manufacturing would be CAD-CAM. Is basically the model. That's essentially what we're doing here. And as I say, all of the information models behind this have been published by the companies and are being incorporated into our ODA and API documentation as we speak. We've been quite successful on the adoption of our APIs by ONAP. I just want to point out that we basically have 3 APIs that are currently adopted. That's Service Catalog, Service Order, and Service Inventory. These have been integrated through what ONAP calls the external API. There are some interesting implementation issues that we've discovered, which are more to do with the internals of the internal modules, which is about handling notifications and some limitations in some of the current limitations in some of the components. Those are being addressed, but it does take time in a kind of a software development model to actually get some of these things sorted out. But the APIs are deployed. The APIs are designed to be polymorphic. That means that a user of these APIs can go and look at the service catalog and from that deduce what they can order from the over the ordering interface, and this can be done dynamically. So the APIs have been designed that way. We're not quite at the point where the internal implementation is able to do that, but that is actually planned, and most of the work's going into that from Orange, I would say, typically. Now, the other piece of work, as I mentioned, this will be my final, more or less my final slide, is around our business operating system. What we've done is, on the model that we've got, the functional model, we've started to show in grey, the light grey boxes, the kind of components that we think we might build in open source. And we're focused specifically around the product catalogue and product order piece. That's this piece at the moment for Nice this year. But what is interesting here is that the red boxes show all the APIs we currently have available on our website. The coverage of those APIs is across almost the entirety of the functional space that we're trying to handle. There's a couple of gaps in the AI area which we're working on, which is about data models for AI and some governance issues around that. But from an API point of view, right now we have APIs to cover nearly everything. Okay, I think I'm more or less at the end, final slide. So it did start a minute or two later. So our view about this is that you need a 360-degree approach. This isn't just about rerunning the automation story for operational processes. It's something broader than that. It's more of a business-led approach. It also means that you need to make concurrent changes in different parts of your architecture. So this isn't about the only thing we need to do is this. It's several things that need to be organised across organisations concurrently, need to take place. In particular, handling legacy systems and wrapping legacy systems. This requires zero-touch capability in 3 dimensions: operational processes, which lots of people talk about, onboarding and lifecycle processes, which people talk about the technical aspects, but not the commercial and the operational aspects. And then you also, for these new markets, need to deal with ecosystems and marketplaces, which we've already addressed with automated processes. And finally, all of this is enabled by our current work on ODA architecture, our APIs, and the work that we're doing in a model-driven approach. And with that, I think I'll finish. Sorry, it was about 30 seconds over, but we did start a few minutes late. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.